The morning begins in silence, as it so often does in a great house where time feels slower than anywhere else. It is not silence, really, for there are always little noises. The kind of soft sounds that belong to houses filled with servants and to lives filled with waiting. There is the faint, faraway creak of the kitchen door, opened at dawn by someone she will never meet. There is the gentle clatter of coal being laid carefully in fireplaces to keep the chill from biting too sharply. There is the whisper of skirts on the stairs as maids climb carefully, carrying trays, carrying water, carrying all the things she will never think to ask for because they are always there, always prepared as though the house itself is her. Caretaker the heiress does not wake quickly, nor with any real desire. She wakes slowly, as though her dreams are reluctant to leave her, and as though the great weight of curtains, pulled tight against the pale London sun, have pressed her into her pillows and refused to let her go. The curtains are heavy velvet, dark as wine, lined with silk, trimmed with braiding that has been dusted again and again by hands that never falter. They smell faintly of dust, though she never notices. The maids notice. They notice everything, and yet nothing is ever said. Her room is enormous, though she does not think of it as such. The tall ceilings stretch upward into shadow, their plaster painted with little flowers that she never looks at. The rug at her feet, once she steps from her bed, is thick with intricate patterns, though she has never studied them. Everything is chosen for her, everything placed with care, and she has long ago ceased to see it. It is only when she is older that she will look back and think of the strangeness of it, all the way her whole world was prepared for her before she even opened her eyes. The bed itself is a mountain of fabrics. There are the linen sheets, crisp and cool, the feather mattress beneath. Sinking beneath her weight, the quilted coverlets, embroidered with flowers, the pillows stacked high, the fringed counterpane. Sometimes, half asleep, she imagines she is drowning in all of it, smothered by her own luxury. She shifts restlessly, half aware of how different this is from the lives of most people, but the thought never lingers. It drifts away like all unwelcome things back into the shadows. The first voice she hears is not her own. It is the soft voice of her lady's maid, knocking gently on the panel of the door before slipping inside. The maid speaks quietly, always quietly, though the heiress does not always answer. A tray is set down water for washing, warm but cooling quickly. In the basin, slippers are placed carefully by the bed, though the heiress will often ignore them and walk barefoot across the rug, to the maid's silent dismay. The fire is coaxed into life again. It crackles faintly, fighting the damp chill that creeps. Into even the richest houses in winter, the heiress opens her eyes slowly. She does not want to leave the warmth of her bed. It is not that she is tired, not exactly, but rather that each day feels the same, so there is no reason to rush. She knows that her breakfast will wait for her, that her lessons or her appointments will wait for her, that her gowns will be laid out whether she rises at 8 or at 9. The house bends around her. Her lateness is scolded, sometimes, but softly, always softly, as though she is too precious to be reproached harshly. And perhaps that is why some people already call her terrible, though they never use the word when she is near. The first part of her routine is dressing, and even this does not belong to her. The maid draws open the curtains, and the weak winter light seeps in. It glows faintly against the glass, caught in dust motes, softening the outlines of her furniture. The wardrobe doors creak open. Fabrics whisper against one another, the rustle of silks, the heavier sigh of velvet. The maid murmurs options, colors, and cuts, but the heiress hardly listens. She stretches her arms lazily, yawns delicately, and lets decisions be made for her. Sometimes she complains. Sometimes she refuses a color, refuses a bonnet, refuses a ribbon. That is enough to be considered rebellious. That is enough to be noticed. Her hair is brushed, pulled, twisted, pinned, and sometimes tugged just a little too hard when the maid grows weary of her complaints. A ribbon is chosen, perhaps pearls, perhaps a comb. It depends on the day and on the visitors expected and on the mood of the house. Always, she must be presentable, even before she has spoken to anyone at all. At last she rises. At last she slips her arms into the gown chosen for her, and at last she moves slowly towards her morning. The house is awake now. She can hear footsteps in the hallway, the faint clinking of silver balusters, the distant chime of a clock that marks time for everyone, but seems to mean nothing to her. Time is endless, repetitive, and patient. There is no hurry. And so the heiress begins her day in the only way she knows, by being prepared for, dressed for, and watched over by a world that does not ask her what she wants. The morning belongs to her, but also does not. It is hers in the way her wealth is hers, lavish, heavy, and slightly suffocating. She does not notice, not fully, not yet. The clock ticks softly. Somewhere the bells of a church sound out the hour. The heiress steps into the corridor, her gown rustling faintly, her slippers brushing against polished wood. Her day has only just begun, and already she feels the weight of eyes waiting for her. Breakfast awaits, and so slowly, softly, she makes her way down to the long table, where silver cutlery gleams, where fruit is arranged, where conversation will be muted, and where every movement she makes will be watched. But that, as you may imagine, is another part of the story. The descent from her bedroom to the breakfast room was always the same, as though the very air in the corridors had learned to expect her footsteps. The floors were polished smooth, so smooth that her slippers sometimes slipped faintly on them, though the footmen never seemed to lose their balance as they stood at intervals like pieces of furniture. Their expressions were quiet, as though they had trained themselves to remain unseen even while standing directly in her path. The heiress walked among them with a kind of slow reluctance, her gown brushing faintly against her legs, the faint rustle of the fabric becoming the only sound in the hallway, the only real sound she allowed herself to hear. The air itself smelled faintly of beeswax polish, of the wood that had been rubbed again and again until it shone, and of the lingering trace of last night's fire smoke that clung stubbornly to the air. It was not unpleasant, but it was heavy, like the rest of the house, always pressing gently, never allowing her to forget where she was, and what was expected of her. The breakfast room waited. It always waited, whether she rose at 9 or half past 9, or later still, depending on how long she lingered with her maid, depending how much she resisted the small indignities of dressing. The long table stretched across the room, polished to a shine so reflective that the silver spoons set upon it seemed to double themselves. The chairs were tall, high-backed, upholstered with pale, carefully chosen fabrics, and they stood like sentinels on either side of the table. At the far end, sunlight filtered in through lace curtains, not strong, not warm, but thin, like a faint veil that allowed light to exist without ever truly brightening the room. On the mantelpiece, a clock ticked softly, a polite little reminder of time passing, though for the heiress time was not something to be managed or worried over. It was simply there, like the furniture, like the silver, like the endless days that mirrored one another. The servants had already been here, long before her. The table was set perfectly, as though it had been measured with rulers and checked, with the eyes of someone who feared even the smallest misstep. Each plate gleamed, each knife and fork lined precisely, each napkin folded into a neat triangle. The fruit was arranged on its platter with more care than most people might devote to their children. Each apple turned to show its best side. Each bunch of grapes draped just so. The peaches nestled against one another like soft, sleeping faces. There were slices of bread laid on warmed plates, little pats of butter shining faintly in their dishes, jars of marmalade glinting amber in the dim light. There was tea, of course, steaming faintly in a silver pot, its handle polished so brightly that she could see her own face distorted in it if she chose to look. And always beside the tea, a smaller jug of milk and a bowl of sugar, each crystal catching the light like pale gems. Everything was in its place, waiting for her. She sat where she was expected to sit, not always where she wished. The chair felt stiff beneath her back, the cushion resisting more than yielding. Her hands rested on the cool surface of the table, and she could feel the weight of the silver. Cutlery beside her, waiting to be used, but also waiting to be judged. For she was never entirely alone, not even the act of eating. Someone was always watching. Perhaps her governess when she was younger, perhaps her aunt when she visited, perhaps the butler, discreetly, his gaze lowered but his mind cataloging. Every small detail of how she moved, how she ate, how she carried herself, and even when there were no family members at the table, even when she sat with only a scattering of guests or companions, there was the invisible weight of society itself, pressing on her shoulders, reminding her that even the angle at which she lifted her spoon was not hers alone to decide. Breakfast should have been simple, but it never was. The heiress, even in childhood, felt the tightness of the moment. The eggs placed carefully before her, soft and steaming, sometimes turned her stomach with their richness. The porridge, sprinkled delicately with sugar, seemed endlessly bland, as though it had been made only for obedience. She preferred the toast, perhaps because it was plain, perhaps because she could bite into it without feeling that it carried a judgment. But even then she was corrected if she buttered it too quickly, or if crumbs fell onto her lap. Each movement, each choice, seemed to carry meaning far beyond its simplicity. She was told always that she must be graceful, she must be elegant, she must be composed. She must not lean too far forward, must not hold the spoon as though she were in haste, must not ever show signs of greed or reluctance or boredom. She must eat as though eating were a performance and she was the only performer, and everyone else in the room was the silent, watchful audience. Sometimes she resisted. She was terrible in the smallest, quietest ways, though terrible was always. The word whispered after she left, never when she was there. She might push the fruit to the side, declaring it tasteless, though the cook had chosen each piece with care. She might refuse to drink her tea, saying it was too strong, though it had been brewed exactly as she had asked the day before. Once, or twice, she laughed when she was meant to be quiet. Laughed because she had noticed the stiffness of the rituals, the absurdity of people staring at one another in silence while pretending not to stare at her. That laughter, soft though it was, traveled further than anything else she had done. It was repeated, it was judged, it was remembered, and it became one of the many little things that made her terrible, though in truth it was nothing more than the sound of a young girl chafing against a room that wanted her to sit perfectly still. The heiress noticed, even when she pretended not to. She noticed how her aunt's eyes flickered to her plate to see how much she ate. She noticed how the governess's voice grew sharper if she lingered too long over the marmalade. She noticed how the butler, solemn and silent, seemed to breathe differently when she reached for the wrong knife. All of these things were small, so small they would have meant nothing in another house, in another family. But in her world, every gesture was a message. Every bite was a line written in the story of who she was supposed to be. And so the breakfast, though it lasted perhaps half an hour, felt like a lifetime. Time slowed in the clinking of silver, in the faint sound of teaspoons stirring sugar into teacups, in the whisper of a napkin folded again and placed on the table's edge. Outside, carriages rattled faintly along the street. The sound softened. By the windows, the hooves of horses muffled, as though the world outside were only a dream. But inside the breakfast room, everything was sharp. Everything was still. Everything was full of eyes. She dreamed sometimes of slipping away, of carrying her plate into the garden and eating there. Barefoot in the grass, with no one to tell her how to hold her spoon. She dreamed of buttering her bread unevenly, of biting into fruit without a knife, of drinking tea without lifting her pinky finger. They were small dreams, not wild at all, and yet they felt impossible. More impossible than any fairy tale she had ever read. And perhaps that impossibility is what made her restless, what made her sigh, what made her quietly rebel. But rebellion could never be loud. Not here, not under so many watchful eyes. Her defiance was always muted, softened, disguised as carelessness, as laziness, as spoiled petulance. They said she was terrible, but she was only tired. Tired of silver gleaming too brightly. Tired of fruit arranged too carefully, tired of tea poured too politely. She longed for something that was not arranged, something not polished, something not watched. But those longings were dreams she never spoke, because she knew no one would understand, and because, in truth, she barely understood them herself. And so breakfast came and went, as it always did. She lifted her spoon carefully. She dabbed her lips with her napkin. She answered questions softly, never too quickly, never too loudly. And when it was over, when the plates were cleared and the fruit returned to its shining platter, she rose quietly, her chair scraping faintly against the floor. The room sighed. With relief, as though it too had been holding its breath, the heiress left as she had entered, her gown whispering faintly, her face serene, her movements delicate. But inside she felt the familiar impatience building, the weight of rules pressing harder with each step. Breakfast was over. But the day had only just begun. And soon enough, there would be dresses to try on, seams to be measured, fabrics to be chosen or refused, corsets to be tightened until her breath caught in her throat. The endless ritual of being dressed, as though beauty itself were heavier than she could carry. The afternoons that followed breakfast were never truly her own, though sometimes she liked to imagine they might be. The clock in the hallway would chime, its voice thin and insistent, and soon enough she would hear the soft shuffle of footsteps, the murmuring of voices that were not meant to be overheard. The seamstresses arrived in twos, sometimes in threes, carrying bundles of fabric wrapped in paper or draped carefully across their arms. They always looked slightly flustered, flushed from the air outside, their gloved hands reddened by cold. In winter, their brows shining with faint perspiration in summer, they bowed their heads when they entered, though not too low, for their eyes were already scanning the room, already measuring the space, already assessing the girl they had been hired to dress. And so the ritual began not with her choice, but with their murmurs, with their tapes and their pins, with their patient sighs and with her resigned stillness. The fabrics themselves had lives of their own. They whispered as they were unfolded, silks that shimmered faintly even in the dim gaslight, taffetas that rustled with a sharpness like dry leaves, velvets that sank into themselves as though they were swallowing the light. She could not help but touch them sometimes, trailing her fingers over the surfaces, feeling the difference between the smooth slide of satin and the coarse steadiness of wool. But the touch was fleeting, always discouraged, always redirected, by a seamstress who guided her hand away gently, murmuring about stains or fingerprints or the delicacy of the weave. She was not to touch too much. She was not to choose too much. Her role was to stand, to lift her arms when told, to turn slowly as though she were a mannequin, while others fussed and muttered and stabbed pins into seams. The gowns were heavy, heavier than she ever admitted aloud. To slip into them was to be swallowed by their weight, to feel the pull of layers upon layers, the underskirts and petticoats, the crinolines stiff with horsehair, the corset laced until her ribs seemed to protest with each breath. She stood, patiently, or at least as patiently as she could manage, while hands tugged and pulled, while voices argued over whether a hem should fall a fraction lower, or whether the shade of lilac suited her complexion. She was consulted, of course. Always she was asked, "Do you prefer this one, miss, or that one?" But the question was not real, and she knew it. If she said she liked the blue, her aunt would remind her that green was more fashionable. If she said she preferred the velvet, her governess would note that silk was more appropriate for the season. The seamstresses nodded at her answers, but their eyes flickered to one another, sharing silent agreements that had nothing to do with her wishes. In the end, the decision was never hers. She was dressed not as she wished to be, but as she was meant to be, as though her body were not her own, but a vessel carrying the family's reputation, stitched into every seam. The corset was the cruelest part, though cruelty was never a word permitted in those rooms. It was simply necessary, simply correct. She stood with her arms resting lightly on the back of a chair, while the maid pulled the laces tighter. And tighter, her spine stiffening, her breath shortening, her body molded into the fashionable shape. Sometimes she grew dizzy, the edges of the room blurring, the voices of the seamstresses buzzing faintly like bees. She would close her eyes for a moment, hoping no one noticed, but someone always did. A maid might whisper, "Breathe, miss," though there was barely space left to breathe. An aunt might tut disapprovingly, as though faintness were a weakness rather than the natural result of being bound so tightly. And always the corset remained, a cage disguised as elegance, its whalebone pressing into her ribs like a reminder. That beauty was not lightness, but burden. And yet, when the lacing was done, when the skirts were layered over the stiffened crinoline, when the bodice was smoothed and pinned and adorned with its bows and its trimmings, the heiress would look into the tall mirror and see not herself, but a figure that society would approve of. The girl in the mirror was taller than she felt, her waist impossibly narrow, her shoulders broad beneath puff sleeves, her skirts spreading around her like a great bell. She was no longer a person, exactly, but a shape and outline designed. To be admired, to be whispered about, to be remembered, and perhaps there was some power in that, though it was not hers to hold. The colors chosen were never quite the ones she wanted. If she longed for pale yellow, she was given cream. If she admired a bold scarlet, she was told it was too daring, too loud, too unbecoming. Instead, she wore lavender, she wore pale blue, she wore soft grays that melted into the dimness of the room she inhabited. Even the trims were dictated by fashion, by family, by some unspoken rule that hovered over her shoulders. Lace at the collar, velvet ribbons at the cuffs, pearls sewn into the bodice. All of it heavy, all of it beautiful, all of it suffocating. She stood quietly while the seamstresses stepped back, their eyes narrowing critically, their heads tilting, as they assessed their work. She felt like a painting being framed, every detail inspected, adjusted, perfected. But painting does not move, does not breathe, does not sigh. And she, despite their wishes, did all of those things. Sometimes she tried to resist in small ways. She might ask for fewer ribbons, only to find more added the next time. She might wrinkle her nose at a shade of mauve, only to be told it was the height of elegance. Once she even declared with a spark of boldness that she would not wear a particular gown because it felt too heavy, too suffocating, too much like armor. The room went silent. The seamstresses exchanged startled glances. Her aunt raised her brows, her voice cool as she reminded the girl that dresses were not made for comfort, but for presentation. And so the heiress lowered her eyes, ashamed but also resentful, and the gown was fitted regardless. Later, when she wore it to a dinner, she felt as though the weight of the entire evening had been stitched into its seams, dragging at her shoulders until she could hardly smile. The fittings could last hours. Pins pricked her skin, though she was told not to flinch. Stiff bodices dug into her ribs, though she was told to stand straighter. Fabrics brushed against her neck, itchy and hot, though she was told not to complain. She learned to hold herself still, to endure, to let the murmurs of the seamstresses wash over her like waves she could not resist. Their voices were soothing, in a way, a low background hum that filled the hours, talking of hems and darts, of stitches and seams, of fashion plates and Paris trends. She listened without listening, the words blending together until they became nothing more than a lullaby of labor, a song of needles and thread. And when at last the fittings ended, when the seamstresses packed away their bundles and left the room smelling faintly of fabrics and candle wax, the heiress would sink into a chair, her body aching from stillness, her breath shallow from the corset's grip. She would press her palms against the armrests, grounding herself in the solidity of the wood, as though reminding herself that she was real, that she was more than silk and whalebone and lace. But even as she sat there, she knew that tomorrow, or the next day, the ritual would repeat itself. There would always be more gowns, more fabrics, more choices that were not hers to make, and so the days blurred together in a haze of fittings and fabrics, of pins and patterns, of dresses that weighed more than her choices ever could. She carried the weight of beauty not as joy, but as duty, and each time she dressed, she felt a little more like a figure carved from marble admired. Polished and admired again, but never allowed to move freely. The gowns defined her in societies. Eyes, but in her own, they were a kind of prison stitched with golden thread. She learned to smile beneath the weight, to curtsy gracefully despite the stiffness, to breathe shallowly but steadily enough that no one noticed. And though the world praised her elegance, though the whispers said she was enviable, she carried inside her a quiet heaviness, a knowledge that the beauty others saw was not hers. But there's Dot, and when the day's fittings were finally done, when the gowns had been hung in her wardrobe, when the pins and tapes had been tucked away, she was led once more to the drawing room, where another kind of ritual awaited her. There she would sit for hours, sipping tea that cooled too quickly, writing letters she did not wish to write, listening to the endless ticking of the clock on the mantel. The weight of fabric was replaced by the weight of time, and both pressed upon her equally. The afternoons stretched longer than the mornings, though not because of the clock. It was the stillness that made them long, the peculiar stillness of a drawing room designed not for living, but for waiting. To enter the drawing room after the fittings was to step into a world of polished surfaces and arranged gestures. A space meant to display refinement in the same way a glass case displays porcelain. The air in the room was warmer than the corridors, softened by the fire glowing in the grate. But it carried the faint perfume of stale flowers, roses that had begun to bow their heads, lilies losing their sharp sweetness, violets fading into dust. The fire hissed faintly, feeding on coal, its warmth pleasant at first, though it soon became too much, pressing against her skin, reminding her of the many layers she wore, reminding her that even stillness required endurance. The drawing room was large, though filled in such a way that it never felt empty. Chairs upholstered in velvet lined the walls, their arms carved with patient precision. Low tables gleamed with polish, carrying stacks of letters, a scattering of books, and always a silver tray with cups and a teapot resting at its center. On the mantelpiece, porcelain figures balanced delicately, a shepherdess in pink, a hound at her side, a child carrying a basket of flowers. Above them hung a painting, something pastoral, cows in a meadow perhaps, or sheep gathered beneath a tree, paintings that seemed to exist to soothe, to remind, to calm, rather than to stir any real feeling. Curtains of heavy brocade framed, tall windows, their folds so thick that even when pulled back, the light that seeped in was subdued. Like candlelight even in the middle of the day, the heiress was placed here, as though she were one of the ornaments, expected to sit gracefully, to write her letters, to sip her tea, to wait for whatever visitors might come. It was not solitude, though she often longed for solitude. A maid slipped in and out quietly, carrying in fresh tea, adjusting the fire, tidying the cushions that hardly seemed disturbed. The governess or an aunt might settle into another chair, her needles clicking faintly as she embroidered, or her lips pursing softly as she turned the pages of a devotional book. And always the clock ticked. Tick, tick, tick. The sound filled the silence between the other small noises. Between the scratching of her pen against paper, between the sigh of the fire, between the faint rattle of carriage wheels, far beyond. The windows, she was told to write letters, and so she wrote them. Her handwriting was neat, too neat, drilled into her by endless lessons. The slope of each letter measured, the curve of each flourish controlled. She wrote to cousins she barely knew, thanking them for gifts she had not wanted. She wrote to her father's acquaintances, conveying polite regards she did not feel. She wrote to friends from childhood who were no longer friends at all, promising visits that would never come to pass. Each letter was a little mask, folded and sealed with wax, delivered into the world, as though it carried her true thoughts. Though it carried only obligations, she sometimes paused, her pen hovering above the paper, tempted to write something real, something of herself. A thought or a complaint or even a little jest. But the temptation passed, always passed, for she knew each letter would be read by others, inspected, judged. Even her words were not truly hers. When she grew tired of writing, she turned to the books scattered on the table. They were novels sometimes, but more often volumes chosen for their safety rather than their pleasure. Moral tales, histories, travel journals written by proper gentlemen. She opened them, read a page, turned another, but the words drifted through her mind without clinging. They became a kind of murmur, like the seamstress's voices had been in the fitting room, like the governess's prayers were in the evening. A soft accompaniment to time passing, not an escape from it. Occasionally, a novel of greater interest slipped through, and she would allow herself to sink into it, to lose herself in the imagined lives of heroines who wandered fields freely, who spoke their thoughts boldly, who loved with passion. But always there was someone nearby to remind her to close the book when it became too absorbing, when her cheeks flushed with the rhythm of the story. Novels, after all, could be dangerous, feeding ideas too wild for a young woman meant to be still. And so she returned to her embroidery, the safest pastime of all. A hoop stretched taut with linen, a pattern sketched faintly in blue pencil, her needle dipping in and out, carrying its colored threads. She worked slowly, half-heartedly, the flowers forming beneath her hand more from habit than from care. She dropped stitches, she pricked her fingers, she sighed. But no one objected, for her embroidery was quiet, and quietness was all that was asked of her. The rhythm of the needle was steady, almost soothing, though never enough to quiet her restless mind. Visitors came sometimes, and then the drawing room changed. A cousin entered, his boots polished, his conversation stilted. A neighbor's daughter, dressed in much the same fashion as herself, sat stiffly across from her. The two girls, speaking of nothing but weather, gowns, and the faintest hints of gossip, though neither of them cared. An aunt's friend might appear, older, sharper, full of questions meant not for answers, but for judgments. Do you read much, my dear? Do you ride often? Do you enjoy the city more than the country? Each answer weighed, each smile measured. Each pause noticed, and always the heiress felt herself shrinking beneath their gaze, becoming not herself, but the image they expected. A young lady, poised, polite, not too clever, not too dull, not too outspoken, not too silent. Sometimes, when the conversation lulled, she would glance at the window. Beyond the heavy curtains lay the garden, its hedges clipped into neat lines, its gravel paths raked smooth. In winter, the fountain stood frozen, its water captured mid-splash, an icicle sculpture that looked almost alive. In summer, roses bloomed. In disciplined rows, their fragrance drifting faintly into the room when the windows were cracked. She longed to step out there, to breathe the air without curtains between, to sit on a bench beneath the trees with no one watching. But it was not the done thing. She belonged inside, in the drawing room, in the chair by the fire. In the endless ritual of polite waiting, the hours crept by, marked by the clock, by the steady pouring of tea, by the arrival and departure of visitors. Sometimes she leaned her head against the back of the chair and closed her eyes. Only for a moment, only until a voice reminded her to sit upright. Sometimes she let her embroidery slip from her fingers, the needle dangling, only to be told to pick it up again. The room permitted no idleness, yet all of it was idle. Busy hands, busy lips, busy postures, but nothing that mattered, nothing that stirred the heart dot. And so the afternoons became heavy with sameness. The heiress learned to smile softly, to murmur agreement, to pour tea with steady hands, to fold her letters neatly. She learned to be graceful not in action, but in stillness, to perform patience as though it were a talent. She was terrible only in her sighs, only in her quiet rebellions, in the way she sometimes let her thoughts wander when they were meant to be contained. Society called her spoiled, willful, difficult, but in truth, she was only weary. Weary of hours that stretched into one another, weary of rooms that stifled rather than welcomed, weary of a life that looked so rich and yet felt so thin. The drawing room held her until the light dimmed outside, until the fire burned low, until the clock struck the late hours in afternoon. At last someone rose, gathering their shawl, announcing, that it was time to prepare for the evening. The heiress followed, rising slowly, her skirts whispering as she moved. She left behind her embroidery hoop, her letters, her unfinished book, all waiting to be resumed again tomorrow. And the day after that, Dot, the drawing room sighed in her absence. The silence settling again around the chairs, the tables, the mantel clock. Tomorrow it would be the same. Tomorrow, the stillness would return Dot and tomorrow evening. She would be carried once more into society, into ballrooms, into theaters where chandeliers glittered and whispers followed her through. The crowd. Evenings in the great house were never quiet, though they often felt as heavy as the afternoons had been. As the sun dipped lower, as lamps were lit one by one, as the household stirred itself into preparation, the heiress felt the subtle shift of the air. Something expectant, something demanding. Society awaited her, and society never forgave lateness. She was made ready not in her own time, but in theirs, carried along as though she were an object polished and set on display. A carriage would wait at the door, its horses stamping softly against the stones, its lanterns glowing faintly in the damp London mist. Before she ever touched its steps, her evening had already been decided for her, the process of dressing for. Society was more elaborate than the fittings themselves. Her maid fluttered about her with nervous precision, tugging at sleeves, fastening jewels, adjusting gloves so tightly they pressed faint ridges into her skin. Perfume was dabbed behind her ears, sharp and floral, not chosen by her but chosen for her. Pearls circled her throat, cool and smooth, weighing lightly yet insistently. Sometimes diamonds, sometimes sapphires, depending on the evening, depending on the guest list, depending on what would best please her aunt. And always the gown shimmering impossibly wide, stitched with trimmings meant to catch the light of chandeliers. She was made into something that gleamed, something that dazzled. She told herself that she did not care, and perhaps she truly did not, but she knew that others cared enough for her. That was what mattered. That was what would always matter. The carriage itself was its own world. She stepped inside with the help of a gloved hand, the door closing behind her with a muffled thud. The air inside smelled of leather and faint tobacco, a mixture she had grown to associate with the endless journeys between drawing rooms and ballrooms, between one house and the next. The ride was really long, but it always felt longer than it was, her body swaying gently with the movement of the wheels, her eyes catching glimpses of lamplit streets through the curtained window. She sometimes imagined the lives in those houses. They passed, the families gathered over supper, the children tucked into bed, the servants sweeping up the day's ashes. Lives smaller, perhaps, but freer. But her own life was bound to society, bound to these rides, bound to the endless circling of parties that waited to judge her. Arriving was always the same. The horses slowed. The wheels crunched against gravel. The carriage door opened. A footman's arm steadied her as she descended, her skirts lifted just so to keep them from the damp ground. Inside the great house, where the evening would unfold, light spilled like gold, spilling from chandeliers that glittered overhead. From sconces lining the walls, from candles reflected endlessly in polished mirrors. The air was warm with dew. Many bodies, with perfume mingling with the scent of wax and wine and roasted meats drifting faintly from dining rooms. The sound was a low hum, voices layered atop voices. Music weaving through the air from a hidden corner where musicians played waltzes that were never meant to end. The heiress entered, and immediately the eyes turned. They always turned as though she carried a flame within her, as though her gown glowed brighter than all the others. She was an heiress, after all. Not the richest, perhaps, not the most beautiful, but marked by her fortune, by her name, by her potential. People measured her with glances as she walked, noting the set of her shoulders, the cut of her gown, the expression on her face. A smile too quick, and she would be called frivolous. A smile too slow, and she would be called cold. Each step mattered, though it was only a step. Each glance mattered, though it was only a glance. The weight of society was invisible, but it pressed against her as surely as her corset did. The ballrooms themselves were grand to the point of absurdity. Ceilings painted with cherubs and clouds, gilded moldings catching the candlelight. Floors polished so smooth that her slippers seemed to glide without effort. Chandeliers swayed faintly with the movement of the crowd, their crystals catching every spark of flame and scattering it across the room. Gowns swept across the floor in waves of color, emeralds, sapphires, ivory whites, soft pinks, each fabric rustling like a whisper, each jewel flashing like a star. Men in black coats and starched collars bowed and smiled, their boots clicking faintly as they crossed the floor. Music swelled, violins rising and falling, guiding couples as they moved in carefully rehearsed steps. It was beauty arranged and disciplined, beauty that demanded obedience. She danced, sometimes. She could not always refuse, though she often longed to. Partners were chosen for her, guided toward her by her aunt's sharp nods, by her governesses' subtle urgings. She placed her hand in theirs, gloved fingers resting lightly, and allowed herself to be turned, guided, swept across the floor. The music carried her, but she felt no freedom in it. Her steps were correct, her posture elegant, her smile faint but sufficient. And yet, even in that perfection, she was judged. If she laughed too freely, whispers followed. If she spoke too little, whispers followed. The whispers were always there, swirling through the air, as steadily as the music, as steady as the clock that ticked behind the grandeur. The theater was no different. There, too, she was on display, though she sat in her family's box rather than danced across the floor. The velvet curtain, the painted scenery, the actors reciting their lines below, these were meant to be the focus. But the true theater was in the boxes themselves, where opera glasses glinted, where ladies displayed their jewels, where men leaned forward to murmur names and stories and judgments. She felt their gaze as surely as if it had been a touch. Even in a darkened theater, she was never unseen. And then there were the smaller gatherings, the dinners, the musicales, the salons filled with carefully chosen guests. Smaller, but no, less heavy. Around the candlelit tables, she was seated strategically, placed beside men her family approved of, beside women who might be allies or rivals. Conversation was measured, practiced, rehearsed as carefully as a dance. She was expected to join but not dominate, to smile but not laugh too loudly, to speak but not with wit that might overshadow. She was meant to be charming but never bold. The tightrope was endless, and she walked it each night with weary precision. She did not always succeed. And that, perhaps, is why society found her terrible. A laugh that lingered too long. A glance held too boldly. A silence that seemed like defiance. These were small things, so small that they should have meant nothing. But in her world, they meant everything. They became stories told the next morning, repeated in whispers at tea, embroidered into something larger than they were. She was watched more closely than others, not because she was worse, but because she was an heiress. And to be an heiress was to belong not to oneself, but to everyone else's gaze, and so society became a kind of performance, endless and exhausting. The carriages, the balls, the dinners, the theaters, each one a stage, each one another evening where she was dressed, displayed and judged. She smiled when she must. She curtsied when she must. She danced when she must. But beneath it all was the quiet restlessness, the soft rebellion that never left her. She longed for freedom, and yet she was praised only when she was contained. The evenings ended as they began, with the carriage waiting, its lanterns glowing faintly in the mist, its wheels creaking as it carried her home. She returned weary, her gown heavy with candle smoke and perfume, her hair loosened at last, her body aching from corset and dance and stillness alike. The house received her in silence, its corridors dark, its servants moving like shadows. She climbed the stairs slowly, her slippers brushing against the rug, the air cool against her skin now that the firelight was behind her dot, and as she lay in her bed, the velvet curtains drawn once more. She thought not of the glittering chandeliers, not of the music, not of the laughter. She thought of the whispers, always the whispers, following her, defining her, echoing in her ears as she drifted into uneasy sleep. Tomorrow would bring another ball, another theater, another dinner. Tomorrow would bring more whispers. And tomorrow, too, would bring the beginning of her reputation, the small rebellions, the small defiance. That would one day make her terrible in the eyes of society. Trouble did not come loudly into her life. Not with shouts or broken glass, not with wild deeds or shocking revelations. It came softly, like most things in her world, drifting in as whispers, carried from drawing rooms to ballrooms, from carriages to parlors, from one set of lips to another, until it grew larger than she ever could have made it herself. The trouble began with little things, so little, in fact, that she hardly noticed them at all when they first occurred. A laugh that lasted too long, a glance held too directly, a reply given with a sharpness of tone instead of the expected softness. These were not the kinds of sins that would destroy a life, but they were the kinds that would linger, because society did not forget the small slips. Not when they came from a girl who carried a fortune on her shoulders. Her laughter was often remarked upon first. She laughed when others stayed silent, laughed when the joke was too simple, laughed when she was supposed to smile politely and no more. It was not an indecent laugh, not crude or raucous, but it was unmeasured, unguarded, a sound that carried. Further than it should in the soft atmosphere of tea and candlelight. People noticed. People whispered. A young woman's laughter was meant to be restrained, to fall like the delicate tinkle of a glass bell, not to roll freely as though it belonged to her alone. She laughed, and they called it unbecoming. She laughed, and they called it spoiled. She laughed, and they began to call her terrible, though always in lowered voices, always in tones that suggested more pity than fear. Then there was her silence. She was as inconsistent as the weather, they said. At one dinner she laughed too much. At another she spoke too little. She would sit, her face turned toward the window, her fork resting untouched beside her plate, answering questions with little, more than a word or two. Yes, no, perhaps. She was accused of sulking, of pouting, of failing in her duty to charm. She knew, though she rarely admitted it, that it was not sulkiness, but weariness. The endless questions about her interests, her opinions, her marriage prospects exhausted her. And so she retreated into silence, the only rebellion left to, in a world where she was expected to perform at every moment. Yet the silence became another fault, another story added to her reputation. Even her dress became a point of gossip. Though she wore what was chosen for her, though every gown had been approved by her aunt, sewn by seamstresses, adjusted by maids, society still found ways to twist it into fault. If she wore lavender, it was said she had chosen a color too pale for her complexion. If she wore scarlet, it was declared too bold, too proud. If she pinned her hair too high, it was called severe. If she wore it lower, it was frivolous. She could not win, and perhaps it was this that gave her the first taste of freedom, because if nothing she did was right, then perhaps it mattered. Less if she did wrong. There were stories, of course, that grew larger with each retelling. Once, she had entered the ballroom without gloves, a mistake she corrected within minutes, but which was recounted again and again as proof of her carelessness, her disregard for etiquette. Once she had refused a dance from a young man her family approved of, claiming she was tired, though she later accepted another partner. This was repeated endlessly, embroidered with suggestions of arrogance, of willful disobedience. Once she had been overheard mocking a sermon, whispering to a cousin about the droning voice of the preacher. It was hardly more than a childish jest, but it was told as scandal, proof of irreverence, proof that she was dangerous in ways she herself could never have imagined. She did not think of herself as terrible. To her, these were small things, hardly worth remembering. She thought of herself as restless, as bored, as impatient with the rituals of her life. But society needed its stories, and so society found them in her. A fortune as large as hers could not be left untethered. It needed to be restrained, controlled, guided by reputation, and if that reputation turned sour, then so be it. The whispers held her more tightly than her corset ever did. The drawing rooms buzzed softly with her name. She is a difficult girl. She is headstrong. She is careless. The words floated on teacups, hidden behind polite smiles, carried across lace-draped tables. They were never shouted, never declared outright, but always murmured, always implied. A reputation does not arrive all at once. It gathers slowly, like dust on the velvet curtains, like soot on the silver. And once it settles, it is nearly impossible to remove. What struck her most, though, was how little she had done. The stories told of her were so small, so slight, and yet they were repeated as though they were great offenses. She had laughed too much. She had spoken too little. She had sighed in church. She had declined to dance. She had worn her hair unfashionably. None of these should have been enough, and yet together they built something larger than themselves. A picture painted in faint strokes that nevertheless became sharp. And she, in turn, began to lean into it. If she was already terrible, if she was already spoiled in the eyes of others, then why not allow herself small freedoms? She let her laughter linger longer. She let her silences stretch deeper. She stood in gardens when she should have been. Indoors, walked without a chaperone across the gravel paths, lingered by fountains until her shoes grew damp. She did not do these things to provoke, not exactly. She did them because they felt like breathing. And yet, each one became another story, another reason to whisper, another brushstroke in the portrait of the terrible Heiress. She was not ruined. She was not scandalous. She was not exiled from society. The trouble was never that large, never that final. It was softer than that, subtler, more insidious. It was a slow accumulation, a layering of sighs and murmurs and criticisms that clung. To her, like the scent of her perfume, faint but inescapable, she became, in the eyes of others, something slightly dangerous, not because she truly was, but because they had said it enough that it became true, and yet, when she sat alone in her bedroom, the velvet curtains drawn, the gaslight hissing faintly. Above, she thought of how her rebellions really were. She was called terrible, but all she had done was laugh, or sigh, or refuse a dance. It seemed almost absurd, and yet it was the truth of her life. Society had made her terrible not because of who she was, but because of who she refused to be. The trouble lingered, and it followed her. It clung to her name, to her presence in every room, to the sound of her laughter drifting down a corridor. It was not loud, it was not violent, but it was there, always there, shaping the way others looked at her, the way they spoke to her, the way they whispered after she had gone. And so, when she walked alone in the gardens, her skirts brushing against the gravel paths, her hands brushing against the ivy that clung to stone walls, she carried the weight of those whispers with her. The garden was quiet, still, patient, but even there she was never truly alone. The echoes of her reputation followed her, soft as footsteps, soft as sighs. The garden was her one retreat, though even that word feels too strong, for she never escaped entirely. Nothing in her life allowed true solitude, not in a world where every step she took was noted, where every sigh was echoed back to her as a rumor. And yet, within the tall iron gates, along the gravel paths that circled the clipped lawns and fountains, beneath the shadow of ivy climbing old stone walls, she felt something that resembled peace. The air in the garden was cooler, fresher, always carrying with it the faint mingling of earth and damp leaves, of roses left untrimmed, of the smoke that drifted faintly from chimneys and then dissolved above the hedges. She would walk slowly, her slippers crunching the gravel, her gloved hand occasionally trailing along the edges of the box hedges, as though the feel of the world beneath her fingertips could remind her that she was something more than a story people told. The seasons marked themselves upon the garden, and so the garden marked itself upon her memories. In spring there was an awakening, though even the word awakening seemed too lively for the way her days moved. The crocuses pushed shyly through the soil. The daffodils trembled in the breeze. The fountains gurgled a little brighter with water unclogged by winter frost. Her dresses were lighter then, pale muslins and soft cottons. and she carried a parasol to shield her from the weak but growing sun. She would walk among the fresh blossoms, pretending for a moment that the world could begin again, that her name might be cleared of the whispers it carried. But even among the blossoms, the whispers clung, just as bees clung to petals. She could not shake them away. Summer was heavier. The roses came into their full bloom, heavy heads nodding, spilling, sent into the air until it was almost suffocating. The stone statues gleamed pale beneath the blaze of sunlight, their features softened by time, but still carrying an eternal gaze that seemed to watch her as she passed. She walked more slowly in summer, her gowns layered though the air was warm. The parasol tilted above her. The grass was clipped neatly, though she never stepped upon it. She kept to the gravel paths, her skirts whispering at her ankles, her movements as measured as the ticking of the great hall clock. And yet even in the warmth, even in the brightness, there was no freedom. A maid trailed her at a distance, always a maid, carrying a shawl in case the heiress should need it, carrying patience in case she stumble, carrying stories in her eyes that would be whispered later below stairs that autumn brought a melancholy. That suited her, though she never said so aloud. The leaves turned slowly, gently, to shades of amber and russet and deep crimson, carpeting the lawns in a softness that felt more alive than the clipped perfection of summer grass. The fountains grew quieter, the ivy darker, the air damp and edged with smoke. She would sit on a bench carved from stone, her hands folded idly in her lap, her gaze wandering to the paths where leaves scurried with the faintest push of wind. The garden felt older then, almost ancient, as though it remembered lives beyond her own, as though it knew that her troubles were as fleeting as the leaves. And yet, despite the comfort of such thoughts, she could never forget that her footsteps were watched, that even in the garden she was performing her solitude, for those who lingered just far enough behind her. And then came winter, the stillest season when the garden seemed almost asleep. The statues wore cloaks of frost. The fountains were drained, or else the water froze at the edges, a thin glassy film that cracked if touched. The hedges were bare, the ivy brittle, the paths sometimes slick with snow pressed flat by the boots of gardeners. In winter, her gowns were heavy, layered with wool and fur, her gloves thicker, her breath visible in the cold air. She walked more quickly then, if only to keep warm, but the garden remained her domain. It was quieter than the drawing rooms, quieter than the long dinners, quieter than the world that pressed upon her shoulders. And yet even in its stillness it could not shield her from herself. In winter the silence pressed against her as heavily as the curtains in her bedroom, reminding her of how alone she truly was. Aloneness was a curious thing in her life. She was never alone, not in the sense of being unaccompanied. Servants lingered, companions hovered, relatives intruded, suitors presented themselves, all with the constancy of shadows. But loneliness was different. Loneliness was the sense that no one truly saw her, that no one truly wished to. In the garden she felt it most keenly. The statues seemed to look at her more attentively than the people in her drawing rooms. The birds in the trees seemed more honest than the guests who praised her gowns. She felt the fountains were more patient listeners than her chaperones. And so she drifted through the paths, lonely in her solitude, lonely in her company, lonely in the name she carried as though it were both a crown and a chain. The benches were her refuge. There was one beneath a great oak tree, its branches twisting. Upward, bare in winter, heavy in summer, always there, older than the house itself. She would sit there when she could, pulling her shawl tightly about her, resting her gloved hands upon her lap, watching the gravel path before her, as though she expected someone to arrive. No one did, not truly, and yet the expectation lingered. Sometimes she imagined she might meet someone who did not care who she was, someone who would not call her terrible, someone who would see her laughter not as rebellion, but as joy. Other times she wished simply to dissolve into the shadows of the ivy, to vanish as though she had never walked the path at all. But wishes were not permitted in her life. They were luxuries she could not afford. Though she had more wealth than she could ever spend, the statues became her companions. There was one of a woman with a pitcher, her face half-worn, her expression unreadable, her stone robes dusted with moss. The heiress would look at her often, wondering if anyone had ever called the statue terrible, wondering if time had washed away all judgments, leaving only silence. She liked to think so. She liked to think that one day her own story would soften, that the whispers would grow quieter, that her name would be less a caution and more a curiosity. For now, she lived in the moment where everything was magnified, where every glance, every sigh, every laugh was repeated until it became larger than herself. Sometimes the garden comforted her. Sometimes it felt like a mirror of her confinement. Its paths curved, but always led back to the same points. Its hedges stood high, enclosing, separating, marking boundaries she could not cross. It was beautiful. Yes, but it was never free. She was allowed to walk it, but never to wander beyond its gates. She was allowed to sit, but never to vanish. She was permitted to admire, but never to claim. The garden belonged to her family, to the estate, to the centuries of wealth that had shaped it, and she, like the statues and fountains, was just another ornament within its boundaries. And so she walked, day after day, season after season, her reputation following her like a faint echo in the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes. She thought of herself as a shadow among the hedges, as a rustle of silk among the leaves, as something both delicate and burdened. The garden gave her silence, but never escape. It gave her beauty, but never freedom. It gave her time to think, though thinking only deepened the melancholy she carried with her dot. The garden walks became her rhythm. Morning walks after breakfast, when the light was still thin and pale. Afternoon walks when the sun slanted and the air was thicker. Evening walks when the lamps were lit along the paths, their faint golden glows flickering in the mist. Each hour had its own character, its own melancholy, its own faint consolation. She walked them all, always with a shadow at her heels, always with the whispers carried in the air, always with the sense that she was being measured against rules she never wished to follow. And so, in the garden, she felt both the closest and the farthest from herself. The closest, because she could allow her thoughts to wander in ways the drawing room never permitted. The farthest, because even there she could not truly shed the weight of being the terrible heiress. And as the seasons turned, as the gravel crunched, as the ivy darkened and the fountain stilled, she carried with her not only the loneliness of her garden walks, but also the heavier burden, the endless lessons of wealth that awaited her within the house. Lessons that would remind her that every step, even here among the roses and stone statues, was tied to inheritance, to dowries, to money measured and guarded and endlessly spoken of in rooms far less beautiful than the garden dot. It was often said that she had everything, and perhaps she did, at least in the way that others measured such things. She had gowns of velvet and silk, pearls that gleamed faintly in the candlelight, silver combs to pin her hair, and a house that whispered of power in every corner ceiling, and every long stretch of carpet that silenced her steps. But wealth, like the garden, was never simply hers. It was a thing she was made to carry, a thing placed upon her shoulders like one of her heavy brocade cloaks. It was not freedom. It was not choice. It was weight. And the lessons of that weight were given to her in rooms that smelled of ink, of paper, of dust, and of men who spoke in droning tones that seemed designed to soothe themselves more than. To instruct her dot, the lessons came early, though not in childhood. For as a little girl, she had been sheltered from them, fed sweets instead of figures, told stories instead of laws. But once she was old enough to be spoken of in society as an heiress, not simply a daughter, not merely a child, the voices changed. Suddenly, she was taken to the library, that long and solemn room lined with books she never read, the curtains drawn against the light so that shadows stretched thickly across the polished table. There she would sit, restless in her chair, her gloved hands folded in her lap, while the solicitor, always a gray figure, always with spectacles perched upon his nose and a watch chain glinting from his waistcoat, spoke of matters she was told were important: property, titles, entailments, settlements, all the words that sounded to her like stones falling into water, one after the other, heavy and dull. She listened, because she had no choice, but her mind wandered, always wandered. She would notice the dust caught in a sunbeam that managed to slip through a crack in the curtain. She would watch the slow rise and fall of the solicitor's chest as he spoke without end, his voice so even that it lulled her nearly to sleep. She would count the lines in the carpet's pattern beneath her feet, or let her gaze rest on the fire that burned low in the grate, its embers shifting softly, its warmth the only gentle thing in the room. The solicitor would clear his throat, perhaps noticing her inattention, but he never raised his voice. It was not necessary. She was present, her body placed in the chair, her presence the proof that she had been instructed. That was all that mattered. The documents were endless. Long pages of parchment written in a hand that seemed to curl and flourish merely to disguise its meaning. Names of estates she had never visited, villages she had never seen, investments she could not picture. There were rents from faraway tenants whose lives she could not imagine, dividends from enterprises she had never heard of, bonds and holdings and shares that were spoken of as though they were part of her very skin. The men around her, the solicitor, her guardian uncle, sometimes her father's old friend, spoke of all of it as though it were a great inheritance to be cherished. But to her it felt like a labyrinth, a maze of numbers and words that trapped her as surely as the hedges in her garden. She had been told all her life that wealth meant freedom, and yet here she sat, hour after hour, bound by it more tightly than by any corset. Her impatience was not loud, never loud. She did not protest in any way that would scandalize. But her sighs were audible, her gaze was distant, her replies faintly careless. When asked if she understood, she would murmur yes, though she did not. When told she must remember a certain law, she would nod, though she forgot before the ink dried on the page. When told that her fortune required care, she would smile faintly, as though fortune itself were a pet to be tended, rather than a shadow that grew larger with every year. These small rebellions, these refusals to care were enough to feed her reputation. A young lady who could not apply herself to her wealth was a young lady who would surely misuse it. A terrible heiress, they would whisper, though in truth her terribleness was no more than weariness, no more than the heavy exhalation of someone who felt the chains of gold pulling tighter each day. The rhythm of these lessons never changed. There was always the table, the documents, the murmuring voices. Sometimes the solicitor droned alone. Sometimes he was joined by another. Sometimes her guardian would speak more sharply, though never cruelly. Always the same phrases returned: settlement, trust, entail, gowry. Words that were not words to her, but weights pressing upon her shoulders. She would think of her dresses, of their heaviness, of how they were chosen for her, and she would think that wealth was much the same. It was clothing she had not chosen, layered upon her until she could hardly breathe. When the lessons were done, she was sometimes asked to sign her name. A pen was placed in her gloved hand, the ink thick and dark, the paper pale and waiting. Her name, written in careful strokes, was all that was required of her. She did not need to understand. She only needed to give her name. And so she signed, always obedient, always present, always lending her identity to things she did not know. The signatures piled up. Pages were folded, sealed, tied with ribbon, placed carefully into boxes. They would be stored in iron chests, in offices with brass locks, in ledgers that would outlast her. Her fortune was secure, she was told, but she never felt secure. She felt only that her name was being spent, day after day, like coin she never touched. The men spoke of her future as though it were an equation. Dowries were calculated, settlements arranged, inheritances traced along family lines as though she were nothing but a point on the ledger. It was not her heart that was measured, but her portion. Suitors would not court her, she realized, without consulting these same men, without listening to the same droning explanations. Wealth was not her freedom. It was her definition, She was the heiress. And because she was the heiress, she was also the terrible heiress, the girl whose laughter came too loud, whose refusals came too often, whose inattention came too easily. Even outside the library, the lessons followed her. At dinner, when her relatives spoke of land and income, she was expected to listen. At balls, when whispers circled about her reputation, she knew that what they whispered of most was not her gowns, not her face, but her fortune. In letters sent to her, neatly folded and sealed, there were always references to property, to estates, to money. Her name was never separate from it. The weight was endless, inescapable, and so she drifted further into her melancholy. She longed for the garden silence, even with its statues watching her. She longed for the lonely path where the crunch of gravel was the only sound. In comparison, the droning voices of the library seemed unbearable, their words flowing like endless water over stones, eroding her little by little, and yet she endured them. She endured as she endured the corsets, as she endured the dinners, as she endured the whispers. She endured because there was no other choice. The fire in the library would burn low. The clock would tick slowly on the mantel. The solicitor would pause only to sip water, his voice never faltering, his words never ceasing. She would sit, her eyes half-lidded, her thoughts drifting to the smell of roses in the garden, the cold bite of winter air, the softness of her pillows. The lessons of wealth were endless, but they were never truly hers. They belonged to the house, to the family, to the name. She was their vessel. She was their signature. And when the papers were at last gathered, when the voices fell silent, she would rise slowly from her chair, smoothing the folds of her gown, her mind heavy with nothingness. She would leave the library as though leaving, a dreamless sleep, stepping again into the hallways where carpets muted her footsteps, where gaslight flickered faintly on the walls. Outside the door, the servants would glance at her as she passed. Some pitied her, some envied her, but none of them knew how it felt to be so laden with fortune, and yet to feel so poor in freedom that her fortune was secure. Yes, but her heart was restless, and restlessness in a young lady of her wealth was always seen as dangerous, always whispered of as candle dot and so a terrible heiress. Burdened by lessons she could not escape, drifted once more into the cycle of her days toward dinners that stretched into shadow, toward tables heavy with silver and crystal, toward evenings where her gaze wandered past it all, seeking something she could never name. There was always talk of suitors, though the heiress herself rarely invited it. From the moment she was old enough to be seen in society, the subject of her marriage seemed to drift like a constant perfume through the air of the house. It was spoken of in drawing rooms, in the half-whispered conversations of her mother and her aunts, in the quieter, sterner tones of her father's study. It was carried to her through letters, the kind written with careful ink and more careful intent. It was felt in the eyes of every guest who regarded her not only as a young woman, but as a young fortune, a living dowry, a great inheritance to be admired, courted, won. And so courtship did not arrive with romance, as she had sometimes read of in her novels. It arrived as an expectation, heavy and inescapable, woven into every hour of her public life. The process itself was orderly, almost ceremonial. Suitors did not simply appear. They were introduced, recommended, considered. Their names were written on folded cards, their families weighed in conversations that lasted for hours, their incomes quietly inquired about by uncles, cousins, lawyers who knew how to look into accounts and estates. It was never only about her. In truth, it was never about her at all. The conversations that decided her future took place in rooms where she was not even present. She was summoned only at the end, when the names were already narrowed down, when the faces were already familiar through description, when she was told softly, politely, that this gentleman or that gentleman would be calling. When they did call, it was never alone. They arrived with flowers, with small tokens, sometimes with books bound in leather, sometimes with chocolates carefully wrapped. But these gifts were not truly for her. They were gestures, signs of respect, symbols of intention. The real offering was their presence, their name, their fortune, their family's approval. They sat across from her in the drawing room, their hats placed carefully upon the table beside them, their gloves held in their laps. They spoke politely, asked her questions that were never very interesting, told her things she did not care to know. The conversation was always stiff, always formal, and though she replied with the expected grace, her mind drifted even as her lips smiled. She thought of the ticking clock on the mantel, of the way the flame of the lamp trembled when a draft crept under the door, of how strange it felt to be so observed while pretending to speak freely. The suitors themselves were varied, though in memory they all seemed the same. There were those who were older, men who looked at her with the gravity of age, as though she were a prize to be won before their own youth slipped away entirely. There were those who were younger, eager and eager again, speaking too quickly, smiling too much, as though their laughter might win her over more swiftly than any fortune. There were the quiet ones who sat as if afraid to speak, who let their mother's letters speak for them. There were the bold ones who leaned forward, too far, who let their eyes linger too long, who forgot that even boldness must be wrapped in decorum. And through them all, the heiress sat, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed, her thoughts restless. Her mother always reminded her that choice was a dangerous illusion. A woman of her fortune was expected to marry well, and to marry well meant aligning families, protecting estates, securing futures. Love was a word that belonged to novels, to poems, to dreams that could be set aside when morning came. What mattered were alliances? What mattered were inheritances? What mattered was respectability. And so her refusals, when they came, were never received kindly. Even when she offered them softly, even when she smiled while saying no, even when she cloaked her rejection excuses, he was too old, too young, too loud, too quiet it was. Noted, remembered, whispered about. Already she was thought difficult. Already she was thought spoiled. Every refusal fed that reputation, until her terribleness seemed not a single act, but a collection of small disobediences that clung to her like a shadow. There were evenings when she returned from a ball, her cheeks flushed with the warmth of the crowded room, her head aching from the music and the chatter, and found her mother waiting in her chamber to ask about this gentleman or that. Did he dance with you twice? Did he flatter you properly? Did you notice the way he stood when the Duke approached? And the heiress, weary, unpinning the jewels from her hair, would only shrug or smile faintly, or confess that she had not noticed it all. She could not explain that she was too tired of the performance to remember the details. She could not explain that her heart did not lift when she was asked to dance, that her smile did not come easily when a suitor bowed before her. To admit such things would be unthinkable. To admit such things would be to reveal that she had begun to resist the very role for which her whole life had been shaped. And yet, she did resist, quietly, softly, with a stubbornness that was never loud but always present. She laughed too freely sometimes, laughed at things that were not meant to be amusing. She turned her gaze toward the garden when a suitor was speaking of his estate. She forgot to answer a question until her mother cleared her throat. She let silences grow where she was supposed to fill them with polite words. And in these small ways, she unsettled the careful rituals of courtship, not enough to be scandalous, but enough to be noticed, enough to be whispered about in corridors, enough to be added to the collection of things that made her terrible. The strange thing was that she did not long for rebellion. She did not wish to run away, to defy her family openly, to throw herself into a romance that would shame them all. She only longed for stillness, for quiet, for freedom from the endless performance. It was not the suitors themselves she disliked, though many of them bored her. It was the weight of expectation, the way each conversation was a test, each gesture a judgment, each silence a mark against her. She felt herself always on display, her life reduced to a single question: who would she marry, and when? It was as though all her existence was simply the prelude to that answer, as though she were only a waiting place for another's name. In the quiet hours after these meetings, when her chamber door was closed, when her maid had withdrawn, when only the faint hiss of the gas lamp remained, she sometimes let herself imagine what life would be like if she were not an heiress, if she were free to say no without consequence, if she could wander the gardens without a chaperone, without fear of being seen, without fear of the whispers that would follow. If she could read a book and never be interrupted by the expectation of company. If she could choose not only in marriage, but in every small detail of her life. These thoughts were dangerous, and yet they came to her as softly as dreams, and she held them close, if only for a moment, before letting them dissolve in the steady tick of the clock. The suitors kept coming. The conversations kept unfolding. The expectation never diminished. And she, the heiress, continued to smile politely, to fold her hands, to resist in small ways that were never enough to free her, but always enough to keep her reputation alive. As something troublesome, something difficult, something terrible, it was not a scandal, not yet, but it was enough. It was always enough, and so the evenings drifted on. The suitors arriving and departing, the flowers wilting in their vases, the gifts placed aside, the names remembered in her mother's lists, and the heiress, quietly restless, sat through it all, her eyes sometimes fixed on the flicker of a candle, her mind drifting far away, her heart whispering something she could never say aloud. The expectation lingered like a perfume that never faded. Courtship was not a season. It was not an episode. It was an atmosphere, heavy and constant, shaping her every hour, defining her every glance, holding her always in its grasp. And she, terrible only because she longed to breathe freely, let it wrap around her like the weight of another gown, another performance, another endless evening. And though she bore it all, though she smiled, though she endured, there was always the whisper that something was wrong, that some rebellion was waiting, that one day even the softest refusals would bloom into a scandal that would never fade. It is remarkable when one looks back how something so small, so fleeting, can become the story that lasts longer than all the other hours of the life. For the heiress who had been marked from her youth as troublesome, as difficult, as somehow always just a little too unwilling to bend, there came a moment, an almost forgettable moment, that changed nothing in her day-to-day existence, and yet seemed to change everything about how she was remembered. It was not a great betrayal, not a grand elopement, not a furious defiance against family or society. It was, as so many scandals were in those softly suffocating drawing rooms, a matter of whispers. And whispers, once they began, had a way of growing louder in the silence of respectable parlors, until they became not just echoes, but truths. The moment began with something ordinary. She had taken a carriage ride, that was all. A carriage ride in the soft, late afternoon. The kind where the light falls golden across the cobblestones, where the air carries the faint smell of horses and coal smoke, where the sky seems both heavy and tender at once. A gentleman had accompanied her. That, too, was ordinary. She had been escorted before, always with chaperones, always with the approving gaze of her family upon her. But this time, the gentleman was not the one her parents preferred. He was not one of the names whispered approvingly in her mother's ear. He was instead the kind who drew polite frowns, the kind who came from a family whose fortunes were not quite so stable, whose manners were charming but not impeccable, whose smile lingered just a little too warmly when he looked at her. And in a moment of weariness, or perhaps curiosity, or perhaps simply because she wanted a breath of air without her mother's presence, she allowed him to ride with her alone. It was hardly daring. The carriage windows were not shuttered. The driver sat in his place above them, the horses clattering forward at their usual pace. The streets were filled with others, passing, watching, nodding their brief acknowledgments. And yet, because she had done so without permission, because the gentleman was not the right one, because society needed only the smallest spark to invent a fire, that ride became the beginning of her scandal. Later, she would remember very little about it, only that she had felt almost peaceful in that moment, watching the city pass by, hearing the hum of the wheels, speaking quietly to someone who seemed content to listen. There was no touch, no wild declaration, no impropriety at all. There was only her presence, his presence, and the silence of a missing chaperone. That was enough. The second part of the scandal was even smaller. A letter. It was not a letter filled with passion, not the kind of letter that poets might dream of or that families might burn to protect their honor. It was an ordinary letter, folded carefully, written in a hand that leaned just slightly too forward, a hand that betrayed eagerness more than elegance. The words were simple, kindly, perhaps too kindly. He had written to thank her for the carriage ride, to say that he had enjoyed her company, to hope that she was in good health. It was not signed with endearments, not sealed with reckless affection, but still it was enough. As the letter was discovered, and once discovered, it became not just a letter, but evidence. Her maid found it first, or so the story went. Perhaps. It was left upon the table by mistake, or slipped carelessly between the pages of a book, or tucked into a drawer that was not quite closed. However, it came to be found. Once it was in hands of her family, it was no longer a simple note. It was proof that she had been careless, proof that she had encouraged the wrong sort of attentions, proof that she was, after all, what people had been whispering for years, spoiled, defiant, and terrible. What followed was not loud. There were no confrontations in the hallways, no furious shouts. Her father did not storm into her chamber, nor did her mother weep at her bedside. Instead, there was silence, a silence so deep that it seemed to coat every room. At the breakfast table, her mother's spoon stirred her tea a little too long. At the dinner table, her father's eyes lingered on her a moment too sharply before, looking away. Servants moved more quietly in her presence, as though not wishing to be caught in the shadow of what had occurred. And in society, in the drawing rooms where gossip fed itself like a flame, her name was spoken more often, her story reshaped and retold, until the simple truth, a carriage ride, a letter, became something far greater in the telling. They said she had written letters herself, though she had not. They said she had lingered in the carriage long after dusk, though she had not. They said the gentleman had kissed her hand when no one was watching, though he had not. They said she had laughed too warmly, smiled too freely, leaned too close. None of it mattered, for gossip does not wait for truth. Gossip becomes truth when repeated often enough, when embroidered with details, when told with the authority of those who claim to know. And because she had already been thought terrible, because her small rebellions had already been noticed, this story fit so neatly into the shape others had made of her that it did not need to be questioned. It was simply believed. The heiress bore it with the same strange mixture of defiance and resignation that had carried her through so many other expectations. She did not deny the ride, she did not deny the letter, but she did not explain either. She did not try to soften the story, did not beg her family to understand. Perhaps deep down, she knew it would make no difference. Once a whisper has become a scandal, no explanation can undo it. And so she let it rest, let it grow, let it cling to her as yet another weight among the many she already carried. Time passed, as it always did. Other scandals arose in society, louder, wilder, more deserving of attention. There were elopements and duels, debts and bankruptcies, indiscretions far more shocking. And yet, even as those louder stories came and went, the tale of the heiresses, carriage ride, and the letter lingered, repeated in quiet corners, retold at dinner tables long after the paper of the letter had yellowed. For that is the nature of a scandal attached to a woman of fortune. It does not need to be grand to last. It only needs to be useful, to be repeated as an example, to be whispered as a warning, to be attached forever to her name. Years later, when she appeared at a ball, people still remembered. They watched her, not only as an heiress, not only as a figure of wealth, but as a woman who had once been careless, who had once let propriety slip. Young women were told her story in softened tones, as though it were a fable. Mothers shook their heads with that particular mixture of pity and judgment. Gentlemen smiled knowingly. as if they had seen too much of the world to be surprised. And she, who had done so little, who had risked so little, became a cautionary tale that outlived every true detail of what had happened. And so the scandal never truly faded. It clung to her more stubbornly than the jewels she wore, more stubbornly than the gown she changed with the seasons, more stubbornly even than her fortune. It became the soft shadow that accompanied her. Wherever she went, a shadow she could neither banish nor escape. And though she sometimes wished, in the quiet of her chamber, that people would forget, she also came to understand that they never would. For society has little patience for truth, but an endless appetite for stories, and thus, in the long years that followed, she was never simply the heiress. She was the terrible heiress, the difficult heiress, the one who had once taken a carriage, ride without permission, the one who had once kept a letter folded too carelessly among her things. It was a small story, a soft story, but it was hers forever. And so, when she walked into rooms and conversations hushed, when she sat in gardens and heard whispers rise like the rustle of leaves, when she danced beneath chandeliers and felt eyes, upon her she carried that story like another layer of her gown, another weight among many, another silence she could not shake. But still, life went on. And in the long hours when she retreated into her private rooms, when the gas flints hissed faintly and the clock ticked its steady rhythm, she tried to lose herself in quieter occupations, embroidery, novels, letters left unfinished. For though the scandal lingered in the air, her days were filled with the same long hours, the same stillness, the same weight of wealth and the expectation that had always shaped her. There comes a time, after the weight of attention has pressed too heavily upon a person, when the world outside begins to fade and the world within becomes the only place left to inhabit. For the heiress, whose life had once been lived beneath chandeliers and amid curious eyes, there grew desire to close doors, to retreat, to be still in spaces where no one watched her every movement. The scandal had not ruined her, not in any visible way. She was still dressed in silk, still invited to dinners, still wealthy beyond need. And yet the whispers that lingered, the glances exchanged behind her back, had woven themselves into every social moment. It was easier, far easier, to remain indoors, to claim weariness, to let her mother attend without her, to allow the bustle of society to carry on without her presence. And so she withdrew slowly, quietly, like a figure slipping behind a curtain. Her rooms became her world. They were not small, of course. No heiress of her standing would be confined to anything less than a suite of chambers. There was a bedroom with heavy velvet curtains, always half drawn, so that the light that entered was filtered, softened, never too harsh. There was a sitting room adjoining it filled with delicate chairs upholstered in pale fabric, a small writing desk, and shelves lined with books her governess once urged her to read. There was even a smaller dressing room beyond, crowded with gowns, shawls, gloves, and the endless ribbons and sashes that marked her station. But though the rooms were filled with things, what she came to love most was not the splendor, not the velvet, or the gilt, but the quiet. The thick curtains and the shut doors created a hush, a softness of air that felt protective, like a cocoon woven from silence. The hours passed differently here. The rhythm of society, morning calls, afternoon teas, evening dinners, gave way to the slower rhythm of the house itself. The ticking of the mantel clock became a companion, its steady sound marking out the hours more faithfully than any bell of the city beyond. The hiss of the gas lamps in the evening created a kind of lullaby, a faint whispering sound that filled the air without ever disturbing it. Even the footsteps of servants outside her door seemed softened, as though they too recognized the stillness she had chosen. In this quiet, she could breathe. She could set aside the mask of perfect manners, the carefully measured laughter, the endless duty of being watched. Often, she took up embroidery, though not with any great skill or dedication. The hoop would rest in her lap, the needle glinting. Faintly in the lamplight, her fingers moving slowly through the fabric. But her stitches were uneven, her patterns unfinished. More often than not, she abandoned the work halfway through. leaving threads trailing, colors half-formed, designs dissolving into nothing. It was not the beauty of the embroidery that mattered to her, but the act of passing time, the soft pricking of the needle, the feel of the fabric beneath her fingers. It gave her something to do while her mind wandered, while her thoughts drifted like slow clouds across a heavy sky. Books, too, became part of her retreat, though she rarely read them. From beginning to end, a novel might be opened and read for a few pages, then left upon the table, its ribbon marking a place she would never return to. A volume of poetry might rest beside her bed, the words glanced at in the dim light before she set it aside, untouched. For weeks, it was not the stories themselves she sought, but the comfort of their presence, the feel of a book in her hand, the illusion of company in the words. Sometimes, she would open a book not to read, but simply to look at the lines, the shapes of the sentences, as though they were patterns meant only for the eye, not the mind. In this way, her books became like silent companions, filling the room, without demanding anything of her. The window was another part of her retreat. She would stand beside it, or sit with her chair drawn close and look out at the gardens below. The glass was often slightly fogged by the damp or speckled with rain, but still she watched. In summer, the roses bloomed in neat rows, tended by gardeners whose figures moved quietly among them. In autumn, the leaves fell in rust-colored drifts, swirling across the gravel paths. In winter, frost rimed the fountain until it gleamed like stone lace. And in spring, the lawn shone with the pale green of new growth. She rarely ventured out herself. The thought of being seen, of encountering others, still pressed too heavily upon her. But from her window she could observe the seasons turning, the world continuing its slow cycle, as if reminding her that time did not need to be filled with action to still be passing. Letters became part of her solitude as well. Not the scandalous letter that had caused her trouble, but the endless polite correspondence expected of a young lady of her station. Notes of thanks, brief acknowledgments of invitations, carefully phrased expressions of regret when she declined them. Her handwriting was elegant, practiced, almost too perfect, as though written by a hand that did not belong to her. Yet as she sat at her desk, dipping the pen into ink, she sometimes wrote other letters never meant to be sent. Letters filled with thoughts she could not speak aloud, feelings she could not show, questions she could not ask. Sometimes they were letters to no one at all, written only to see her thoughts placed upon paper, only to fold them carefully and slip them into a drawer where they would remain unread. In this quiet ritual, she found a kind of release, a way of speaking in a world where voice was so often unwelcome. The servants, of course, noticed her retreat. They were the ones who carried trays of tea into her rooms, who tended the fire, who adjusted the lamps. They were the ones who saw how often she remained behind those doors, how rarely she joined her family in the grander spaces of the house. Among themselves, they whispered, as servants always did. Some pitied her, thinking her lonely. Others envied her, imagining the luxury of such solitude. But none of them truly understood the heaviness of her retreat, the way it was both comfort and confinement. For though the rooms were hers, though they were filled with beauty and silence, they were still gilded cages. She was free to stay within them, but not truly free to leave. And yet, in those rooms she found a kind of survival. The world outside demanded too much of her. Too many smiles, too many explanations, too many eyes waiting for her to falter again. Inside, she could be only herself, even if that self was restless, melancholy, unfinished. The embroidery left, half done, the books left unread, the letters left unsent. All of these were fragments of her true life, fragments no one else ever saw. In the stillness of her chambers, she became something softer, something less defined, something almost like a shadow of the girl she had once been. Evenings were the hardest. When the lamps were lit and the rest of the house filled with voices and music, she often lay upon her chaise, listening. The sounds carried faintly through the walls, laughter, footsteps, the distant strains of a piano. They reminded her of all she was missing, of all she had once been part of. And yet, she remained apart, not entirely by choice, but not entirely unwilling either. She had become accustomed to absence, to the quiet that wrapped itself around her. It was a melancholy comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. Nights stretched long. She often lay awake, listening to the ticking of the clock, watching the flicker of shadows across the ceiling as the gas lamps hissed faintly. The bed was large, the sheets heavy, the air cool with the drafts of an old house. She would drift in and out of sleep, her dreams filled not with vivid scenes, but with fragments, with faces blurred, with half-remembered words. When morning came, it came slowly through the softened light of her curtains, and another day in. Her retreat began again, and so her world grew smaller, not with bitterness, but with a kind of weary acceptance. The scandal had pushed her into these rooms, but it was not the scandal alone that kept her there. It was the weight of expectation, the constant watching, the endless performance required of her. In retreat, she found a fragile kind of peace, even as she knew it was not freedom. And in that peace, she lingered day after day, year after year, until her rooms became not merely her refuge, but the truest shape of her life. And from here, softly, we drift with her still into the quiet. Spaces where servants watched, where envy and pity stirred, where her presence was both seen and unseen. For next, we will walk with her among those who served her, who saw more than society ever did, and who whispered about the heiress behind closed doors. In a great Victorian household, there were always more eyes than one realized. Always more. Ears catching fragments of words, more hands tending to details too small to be noticed, but too essential to be ignored. The heiress might have thought herself alone in her retreat, but she was never truly unseen, never truly unwatched. The servants, who moved like shadows through the corridors and stairways, observed more than the family ever imagined. They polished. The silver carried trays of tea, stoked the fires, brushed the dust from velvet drapes, and all the while they watched her. Not openly, not rudely, but with the quiet attention of those whose work required them to notice, to understand without asking, to learn the moods and silences of their betters in order to serve them. And so, while society gossiped from afar, it was the servants who knew the heiress most closely, even if they never knew her truly. There was the maid assigned to her rooms, who came each morning to draw back the curtains and open the shutters, though she never pulled them wide, for the heiress preferred her light softened. This maid noticed how often her mistress remained in bed longer than the hour deemed proper, lying still beneath the canopy while the world below bustled awake. She saw the embroidery hoop left abandoned on the chair, the book lying face down. On the table, the ink stains on the desk from letters half written. She collected the unsent notes, folded and tucked away, not reading them, but always aware of the drawer that grew heavier with secrets. She smoothed the gowns that were chosen, but unworn, adjusting the fabric so it would not crease. And in her own quiet heart, she wondered what it was like to have so much and to use so little, to live surrounded by finery yet without joy. The footmen, tall and polished in their livery, carried in the trays of food that so often returned barely. Touched, they whispered in the kitchen about how the heiress rarely ate, how her appetite seemed dulled, how the delicate pastries and fruits went half-spoiled before being carried away. They compared her to the ladies at dinner parties who ate only sparingly, always with a kind of show. But with her it was different. There was no performance, no careful display of appetite. It was simply disinterest, as if the food itself, no matter how lavish, held no power to tempt her. And so the footmen shook their heads and muttered among themselves, sometimes pitying, sometimes scornful, but always watchful. Down in the servants' hall, the gossip about her never ceased entirely. For while the family spoke of her scandal, in hushed tones the servants discussed it more freely, though never in her presence. They spoke of the carriage ride, of the letter found, of the whispers that lingered like perfume long after the truth had faded. Some thought her reckless, others foolish, still others brave in a way no one else dared to be. And even in their criticism there was a fascination. For she lived a life they could never imagine, a life of gowns and jewels and rooms to herself. And even when she was spoken of as terrible, there was envy in the telling. To be terrible in their world was a luxury. To step outside the rules, even slightly, was a freedom denied to them. The butler, a man of stiff bearing and deep knowledge of the family's history, had watched her since childhood. He had seen her run through the halls as a girl, trailing. Ribbons and laughter, unrestrained in ways that already hinted at her future reputation. He had seen her grow into the young woman who now lingered in her rooms, who moved less like a child and more like a figure in a portrait. He said little of her to the others, for his position demanded discretion, but even he allowed himself the thought that wealth did not always bring happiness. When he poured the wine for dinners, she did not attend. When he announced guests, she chose not to see. He felt the absence of her presence as keenly as he once felt the brightness of her laughter. And in the privacy of his own reflections, he admitted that the house itself seemed quieter, heavier, because she had withdrawn from. It thought there were whispers among the junior maids that the heiress was not unkind, only distant. When they carried water for her baths or laid fresh linens on her bed, she rarely spoke, rarely looked at them directly. Yet there were moments, fleeting, unexpected, when her gaze would soften, when her hand would pause on the fabric as if to acknowledge the one who held it. She gave no orders in a sharp tone, no punishments for small mistakes. Instead, her indifference became its own kind of shield. The servants could not decide if she was gentle or simply lost in her own world. Some pitied her loneliness, others dismissed her as spoiled. But all of them, in their own way, felt the strangeness of her silence. The weight of her retreat got at times. The heiress overheard their voices drifting through the half-open door, or caught the murmur of gossip as she passed. She did not always mind. There was, in truth, a strange comfort in being spoken of, even in whispers. It reminded her that she still existed beyond her rooms, that she was still a figure of interest, however small. Sometimes she even wondered what it would be like to trade places with them, to move unseen, to serve rather than be served, to have one's labor define the day rather than one's reputation. Of course, such thoughts were fleeting, impossible dreams, yet they came to her nonetheless. As she sat with her embroidery or stared through her window at the garden below, the servants also saw the small rebellions that society missed. They noticed how often she left her hair slightly undone, how she wore slippers instead of shoes when alone, how her gowns remained unworn while she lounged in simpler attire. They noticed her laughter, too, rare but unrestrained when it came, spilling out suddenly in a way that startled even herself. They noticed how she lingered at the window long after she should have been preparing for the evening, how she read novels considered frivolous, how she sometimes hummed under her breath when she thought no one listened. To society, these would have been small shocks, signs of her terrible nature. To the servants, they were glimpses of humanity, glimpses that made her less distant, less untouchable dot in time. Her relationship with the servants became a kind of unspoken truce. She relied on them, as every heiress did, yet she allowed them space to move quietly around her without demand. They, in turn, gave her the illusion of solitude, tending to her needs without intruding on her retreat. It was a delicate balance, she the mistress, they the servants, yet bound together in the silence of her chambers. And though none of them would ever have said it aloud, there was an intimacy in this arrangement, a closeness born not of conversation, but of presence. They knew her in ways society never could, not as a figure at a ball, not as a name in a scandal, but as a young woman half hidden in her rooms, surrounded by half-finished things. That it was perhaps this quiet knowledge, this accumulation of small observations that preserved her story long after society had grown bored. For when the guests ceased to speak of her, when the family allowed the scandal to fade into memory, it was the servants who still remembered. They remembered the books left open, the letters unsent, the laughter too rare to be forgotten. They remembered her footsteps in the corridor, the way her presence filled a room without ever needing words. And in their memories whispered too, One another in later years, she lived on, not as the terrible heiress society condemned, but as the lonely, restless figure they had known more intimately than anyone else.